welcome everyone. And a big hello to those joining us online as well. Thanks for taking the time to be with us here today. It's great to see so many people here this morning. I'm Tiffany Tsang. I'm a policy lead at the PLSA, and I'm really pleased actually to be introducing this very important session today, which we're going to be aiming to identify and understand some of the drivers and to understand some of these drivers as well and how they shape possibly the future look of the pensions landscape. So to give a bit of context, most of you already know in this audience, DB schemes are continuing to wind down. People are living longer living much longer than ever before. We're witnessing huge shifts of responsibility onto individuals for their retirement and well-being. So what can we do to help ensure that as many people as possible reach good retirement outcomes? So here with me today are three experts to help us to begin to unpack this very complex question. We've got Daniela Silcock, who is head of policy research at PPI and will be speaking to us about the retirement savings gap. We have Matthew Arends, who is partner and head of UK retirement policy at Aon and will be discussing consolidation in CDC. We have Tim Giles, senior partner and head of investment in the UK and Ireland for Aon, and we'll be focusing on the changing attitudes and ideas around investment. So before I turn it over to them, just two quick housekeeping issues. For those of you who are able to, please do tweet this session using hashtag PLSA Annual. And for those watching online and here, there will be a conference app that you can log into and send questions to us. I'll be monitoring during the session. So without any further delay, Daniela.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming at this early hour. So I'm the head of policy research at the Pensions Policy Institute. For those of you who don't know, we're an independent research institute that does analysis and modeling on both state and private pensions, and we're entirely non-political and non-partisan. So I'm going to talk to you a bit about what the actual retirement savings gap is over the next 7 to 10 years. But before I go into detail, it's worth looking at the overall trends that we're seeing in terms of retirement income. We expect retirement incomes to fall on average over the next few decades. This is a result of people reaching retirement with lower levels of DB entitlement than they will have previously done. And also, crucially, because people are no longer able to accrue entitlement to the additional state pension, which actually was quite a significant amount of pensioners' income in the last few decades. It is expected, because of automatic enrollment, that people will be accruing a lot more in DC pensions over the next few decades. So we're likely to see incomes start to rise again on average for pensioners. And DWP projections estimate that incomes in terms of earnings terms will meet current levels by around 2060 again. But crucially, they did say that that depends on the triple lock inflationary measure for state pensions remaining in place. So if the triple lock is removed, it may take longer for pensioner incomes to come back to current levels. So focusing a bit more in the future, in 2025, I've gathered some stats on who's likely to be saving in 2025. We've estimated at the PPI that there'll be about 14.3 million active members of DC schemes in 2025 and 6.3 million active members of DB schemes, which includes the public sector, which is about 5 million. So that's actually quite a big figure, 20.6 million active savers in 2025. However, if you consider that there will be 43 million people of working age in 2025, that means just under half of those people are likely to be active pension savers. But that's up from 35% of working age people in 2012, 2014. So we're definitely going in the right direction there. So who is this 52% who isn't saving, or who isn't likely to be saving unless there's behavioral or policy change? A big chunk of those will be the self-employed. We've got over 5 million self-employed people right now in the UK, and only a quarter of those were saving in a pension in 2014, 2016. Women, as you can see, are slightly less likely to save than men because of the way that they work. They tend to be less likely to work full-time and less likely to be eligible for automatic enrollment. Carers and disabled people, find it a lot harder to be in the labour market and often are more likely to work in part-time jobs. And of course, those who are unemployed or inactive are very unlikely to be saving in a pension. So how much are these people going to be saving in 2025? What are their incomes likely to be? We brought together some average stats. So the median DC pot at state pension age in 2025 is likely to be somewhere below £50,000. So people might be able to get around £3,000 a year from a pot of that size if they got an annuity. The average DB income in 2025 will be around £4,200, and the average state pension income around £7,800. You might say, but that's lower than the new state pension level. But this is an average, and this is based on people who, some of whom will not have full entitlement yet to the new state pension, because we're only looking at about 7 to 10 years ahead. We're also estimating that people have median housing wealth of around £140,000. So how much does that give you? Well, a worker who's aged between 50 and 59 in 2025 would have a median income of around £31,000. So at retirement, if they wanted to replicate working life living standards, they'd probably be looking for an income of around £20,000 a year. Also, you could use the hitting the target stats and say if they wanted to achieve a modest standard of living, they may need an income of somewhere between £20,000 and £25,000. Now, if our hypothetical pensioner is the average Joe that probably doesn't exist and has the average income from each of these sources, they'll have an income of around £15,000 a year. So you could say for this average person, their savings gap or their income gap is around £5,000 a year. Obviously, most people are not the average, and there will be people who have far lower incomes and also people who have far higher incomes. But there will also be people who need quite a lot more than £20,000 a year in retirement in order to feel that they're achieving an adequate income. But just so you don't get too depressed, I wanted to show you a chart showing how quickly we see DC savings going up as a result of auto-enrollment. And particularly now, in light of the fact that opt-outs are remaining low at 9%, it looks like we really are going to be seeing a rise in the level of income people receive from DC. So this just shows how the distribution is going up for two cohorts, those aged 55 to 64 in 2018, and then 45 to 54 in 2018, how much DC savings they're likely to have at their state pension age. And you can see the median goes up over 10 years from around 27,000 to around 48,000. So it's not all bad news. One more thing that's worth considering when looking at the future and the savings gap and how much people will need is that consumption patterns are changing. We're seeing as new cohorts of people are reaching retirement that they're likely to be spending more on care for a family member. They're also more likely to have to be funding care for themselves because they're living longer. They're more likely to be providing financial support for family members, and crucially, much less likely to own their own home over time. So we're going to be seeing a lot more pensioners reaching retirement while either still paying off a mortgage or paying rent. So this means people are going to likely to need to spend a lot more money to achieve an adequate standard of living in retirement. That either means consuming more of their income or having more income to consume. So that was a whistle-stop tour of the savings gap. Just to conclude, we're seeing incomes going down, we're seeing consumption going up. So I think the overriding conclusion is people are going to need a lot of support to know how to properly access their savings to meet changing needs with lower levels of income. Thank you. And I will pass over to Matthew.
Thank you, Daniela. Right. So, let's keep going. Right, yes, Matthew Arends, Aon, Head of UK Retirement Policy. I'm going to talk today about private sector pensions and give you my crystal ball vision for what pensions might look like in 2025. And I should say this is going to be a very personal view, not necessarily Aon's view. They're colleagues of mine in the audience who might very well disagree with some of my predictions that are coming up. All right, so what do I see? I see out there two macro forces that are affecting our industry: consolidation and collectivism. And what I'm going to do is walk you through my thought process for how those forces are going to affect us. So let's start, let's pick that apart, first of all, in the consolidation bucket with DB consolidation. This is the graph of the statistics straight out of the PPF's Purple Book for the number of DB pension schemes. And, you know, we start at 7,000 10 years ago and then decline. And, you know, the actuary in me says, after the first year, that's a straight line, right? And by 2017, we're down to 5,500. So if you look at the slope of that straight line, that says about 150 schemes a year are leaving the population. Oh, and, you know, how are they leaving? Well, some of them are merging. Yeah, I accept that. But most of the schemes are leaving this population either because they're winding up or because they're entering the PPF. And you could argue both of those routes are a form of consolidation. So I think this is a chart of DB consolidation. So the natural question is to say, well, look, if you've got that slope of 150 schemes a year leaving the DB population, what's it going to look like in 2025? And if you just continue the graph at that rate, you get to 4,500 in 2025. So not a material difference, you might argue. But I think the bigger question is, actually, do we expect that trend to continue or indeed accelerate? And I think there's some pretty good reasons why it could well accelerate over the next 3 years. Just quickly on those, what are they? First of all, 4,000 of our 5,500 schemes in 2017 had less than 1,000 lives in them. Average asset size, 35 million. These are relatively small schemes. They are getting better funded, as DB schemes are. Arguably, it's easier for employers to get their arms around those sizes of schemes and move them to insurance. So that's one reason. Second reason is DB schemes are maturing, generally. More pensioners, fewer deferred pensioners, arguably, on a relative basis at any rate, cheaper to insure. And the third reason is insurance and PPF, that's not the only consolidation option these days. We now have commercial consolidators added onto the list of potential routes. You know, what impact do we think they're going to have on the industry? Very difficult to say because it's still early days. By 2025, we'll have had consolidators for 7 years. That will have started having an impact. So you put all that together, you say 150 a year leaving the population. What if we double that? Let's, you know, be generous. 300 a year leaving. Actually, you still end up with 3,500 DB schemes in 2025. So I think consolidation will affect DB, but perhaps DB won't feel desperately different in 2025 to the way it does today. So let's move on. Consolidation in DC, what does that mean? And I've got 3 numbers for you. Let's start on the left, 34,130. Well, according to the TPR's scheme return, that was the number of occupational DC schemes in the UK, 34,000. Right? I'm still blown away by that number. Now, you might argue that's not an entirely representative statistic because over 30,000 of those have less than 5 members in them each. So, you know, let's strip them away. Let's strip away those 30,000 and concentrate on the remainder. That's still 3,500 DC schemes in the UK. If you contrast that with Australia, for example, their equivalent figure would be under 200. So, you know, is there scope for consolidation here? I would argue yes. How? Well, that takes us to the next number, the 25%. This is from our own DC scheme survey from last year. 25% was the proportion of schemes that expected to move to master trust. So a quarter of my 3,500 over the next 5 years move to master trust. That still leaves 75% who aren't, who are expecting to stay where they are. Which takes me to my final number, the 81. 81, again, in TPR's scheme returns, 81 was the number of master trusts, DC master trusts existing at that point in time. Now, from what I read, as we go through the authorization regime, over 80 is now less than 60. So we're already seeing some movement on that, and we were covering that in the session just before we came in here, is about the consolidation in this marketplace. I think that's set to continue. I think once we've come out of the authorization regime and actually fast forwarded to 2025, that will have accelerated quite considerably. And today's 81 or 60 DC master trusts that perhaps typically have a few £100 million in them will have become about a dozen with a few £billion in them. Materially different landscape that I foresee for DC by the time we get to 2025. So that's schemes. What about the other aspect of consolidation? What it means for us as individual savers. And here's my prediction for you. By 2025, we will have stopped trying to educate people to be pensions experts because it doesn't work. Right? Most people don't want to be pensions experts. What they want is to be told what the right thing is to do. Now, I think the solution to this is technology. And this is one example of a way to pull together both pension savings across all different saving schemes that we will get during our lifespans, but also other forms of savings. And by the way, it's not just savings, it's debt as well that needs to come into this equation. But, this might look advanced today. By 2025, this will look like child's play. And actually, by that stage, we will start having technology guiding us on the kinds of financial decisions that we need to make. Based on all your information, have you considered paying an extra 1%? Have you thought about paying down your debt rather than increasing your savings because that's more efficient? So I think technology is going to be a big part of consolidation for us as individual savers. And that takes me on to this, collectivism, as we move away from consolidation. Now, just as an aside, yesterday was a really watershed moment, I think, because for the first time we had actually Frank Field sounding happy about pensions. I don't know if you saw that, but he was reporting on the work his pensions committee had done on collective DC, this subject, and the fact that there was a 10-minute rule bill in the House of Parliament yesterday on collective DC, bringing forward the next step in having the UK's first collective DC scheme. Right, so what? What does that mean for pensions in 2025? The thing that collective DC provides is an income for life where the individual doesn't have to make complex investment decisions. So we know about Royal Mail and the CWU, but I think by 2025 we will see some of those dozen DC master trusts implementing a collective DC option alongside regular DC savings as a way of individuals getting an income for life out of their DC savings. So I'm pretty much out of time there. I'm just going to summarize by saying, what do I see in 2025? I see, yes, consolidation, but arguably DB feeling rather similar to today. DC, however, I think is going to feel quite different by 2025 and will have moved on a long way. I think the individual, and we were hearing about that in the previous session, the individual will start actually feeling more engaged in the whole savings process through the way technology will be talking to them and suggesting to them how they save. And I think we will find new ways of attaching retirement options to members' savings through things like collective DC. So with that, let me hand over to Tim.
Try and navigate the furniture on the stage. Good morning, all. My name is Tim Giles. I head up Arends' investment business in the UK and Ireland. I'm going to probably follow a similar format to Matthew around how we present this. Oh, if I go the right way on the slides. Know how the clicker works, first challenge. I'm going to talk about two themes. There's other things we could talk about in terms of asset markets, but two themes. The first is what I'm going to call the rise of the responsible investor. I guess looking at this august body, I'm not sitting here and saying there's a lack of responsible investment within the UK. Responsible investing to us is how you take into account ESG factors in coming up with a sensible investment strategy. Environmental, social and governance factors. So that's the first one. Sounds like the microphone's slipping in and out. The second one is what I've called the drive for value. Basically, as increasing transparency around the costs of asset management come to the fore, there is increasing drive to drive down those costs of asset management. Rightly so, everybody would like to get their investment returns more cheaply. And that is a big theme as we see within asset management. So moving through those, what's driving these in to investment management? I think there's 4 factors. Most of them are common to both areas. The first one is demographics. The millennials, whilst they do not have a big share of pensions assets to date, they are driving a large number of those DC savers that Daniela was talking about. And they actually expect more of their values and views to be reflected in how they invest their assets. They are worried about the future. And they are sort of saying that should be reflected in how we invest our assets. So the first one about responsible investment. The second one about big data, that's affecting both areas. The amount of data companies are disclosing in relation to ESG factors has astronomically increased. And the other thing is the amount of data you can get to analyse the costs of your asset management is increasing. I think that's just about to come to the fore even more. The third, government and regulatory pressure. In terms of regulators, there is a queue working around responsible investing. TPR, I see Fred over there as well in the audience, FCA, DWP, Environmental Audit Committee, all of them wanting something done about responsible investing. If I look within the costs of asset management, the FCA, the CMA, DWP, again, looking to change how that's operating. So enormous regulatory pressure. And the last one then is returns. Everybody wants the returns from their investments. And actually, responsible investment should drive better returns. And if you think about it, the simplest one is if you pay less for getting the same investments, you're going to get better outcomes. That one's easy. Okay, so that's what's driving it. I'll come to the 3 numbers. Obviously, Matthew and I go to the same presentation school. First one, 30 trillion. Huge number. That is representation of the amount of assets that are invested in socially responsible investment today. That is 30% of assets globally. The second one, 29% of millennials, when they pick an investment advisor, not necessarily sort of the consultant of a scheme, but the investment advisor they want to work with on a personal basis, they're looking for somebody who takes account of their values in doing that. And that is higher than any previous generation. The last one, 2 billion people, that's growth in population around the globe, which will drive more demand for social infrastructure. Where is the funding for that social infrastructure going to come from? It's from the responsible investors. Okay, so what? That's the trend, responsible investing is coming. What do you do about it? The first question I would ask is, we've done a survey recently. We've surveyed a number of our clients globally around how they feel about responsible investing. And the one thing that is clear from that survey is pretty much every investor says that responsible investing thing, it's the task of my managers or my investment consultant. 60% or more are saying that. So understand what the manager is doing. Understand how your consultant is rating those managers. You need to know how that's been taken account. The second one is the beliefs around this. There is enormous amounts of confusion about the impact of responsible investing. Intuitively, having more information about how companies operate environmentally, socially, and their governance is good for your investment decisions. Yet many investors, about 40% from our survey, fear it's going to impact their investment returns in a negative fashion. So actually, the first thing to do is understand the views. Discuss them, do a survey, and actually come up with some clarity around what you believe around responsible investing. The third one, impact on strategy. Simple scenario testing around climate change, but equally, again, investors, around 30% are looking to make positive inclusions within strategy from responsible investing. The last one, this is required to be in SIPs by October 2019. Again, from our survey, around about half of UK schemes have a policy around responsible investing today. You need one by this time next year. Okay. So moving on to costs of asset management. Why are investors wanting more for their money? So the first one, that 36%, that's the FCA's number. That is the average profit margin of an asset manager. And if you adjust that for actually pay levels within asset managers, because some of them get paid reasonably well, I understand, that margin actually looks even higher, okay? So there is scope for them to actually charge a bit less for their services. The second one is this is the advent of assets that are looking for cheaper ways of investing. Factor investing, as we call it, it's ways of getting some of the benefits of active equity investment without the price, is the way I'd classify it. That's estimated to reach 3.4 trillion by 2022. That's double current levels. So there is definite demand for lower cost forms of active investing. And the last one there, the 80 billion, that is the estimate of 2026 of the DC investment in that type of factor investing. So 80 billion, that's 20 times current level. So massive improvement expected there. Okay, so this chart though as well, my fear around this is, value is good. So it's back to the Oscar Wilde quote, a cynic is the person who knows the price of everything and the value of nothing. This is around, before we go driving after cost without thinking about it, let's think about where value lies. On the chart there, which is probably hard to see from the back, is a graph of returns over the past 5 years, volatility along the bottom axis, and return going at the top. Clearly, you'd like higher returns with lowest volatility. So you want to be near to this side and as high up as possible. In the top corner, the yellow one, that is the cheapest investment. Passive, market capitalization, equities, yeah? So returns looking pretty good over the past 5 years, not a guarantee of the future, because markets will change, equities have a benign environment, but the cost was volatility. So you think about that, well, let's assume equities weren't going to do well. I'm going to go invest my growth assets across a mix. I'll go and buy one of those diversified growth funds that are out there. And those blue dots are the diversified growth funds across the database of a member. What you see there, you're now paying higher fees. Those are active fees across those, and you'll see a range of return and volatility. Some of them are actually giving very little return, but there's a range of return and volatility. But you're thinking, actually, do I want that? Do I want to pay much? Is there a cheaper alternative? And that's where things like this factor approach, more systematic ways of getting active management. And the red dot, the square dot, there's two red dots, so how do I point to the one on the farthest side away from me is representative of that. So returns are better, volatility is slightly lower than equity, so it's okay, but it's still volatile. And the last one then is go for a best of breed active manager with illiquid assets as well, because none of the other ones have got illiquids in there, and that is the red dot in the center. And that's just representative of a couple of portfolios within there. But what I'm saying is, as you go through those, you've got the first one really cheap, the second one actively managed, but a different type of active management, the third one low-cost active management, and the last one, range of illiquids, which will cost more. So you want to make sure you're paying your active management on that value spectrum at the bottom for the right types of asset management. It is worth paying, it's going to prove outcomes. There's materially different results in the outcomes there with different prices. So driving price down without responding to how that's going to affect your outcomes is a bad result. Okay, so last piece, so what? First thing we suggest is undertake a full cost audit. There are utility coming to the market on the back of all the work the FCA has been doing with the Institutional Disclosure Working Group to disclose costs. Simple utilities which will get costs for all pension schemes. They're about to come to market. So get the costs, understand them, but more importantly, benchmark them. And don't benchmark them to see is it the lowest it can be against everything. Benchmark them against relevant peer managers. And then take action on the results. Most asset managers, when presented data that their costs should be better, will do something about it. And the other piece is, how can you actually improve that deal? Well, I think this is about, Matthew's talked about consolidation, collectivism, all these things. Actually, that is also good around driving down asset management costs. So I'll give you a couple of examples. The first one, factor investing. Many of our clients at the moment are looking to move from basic market capitalization, passive investing, to something around factors to get a better diversified strategy. By working together collaboratively, they're getting a better deal and actually changing from what I would view as a poorer quality form of passive management to something cheaper that's having some of the benefits of active management on a diversified basis without paying more for it. Fantastic, by working together, collectivism. I couldn't stand up here and not mention fiduciary management, given what we do within our business. That is, again, for me, another way of consolidating assets, brings scale to them, but also reduces the task on the asset manager by reducing their service costs. So that's about getting a good price. Getting a good price, that is principally, for me, around this benchmarking. But I will say again, because I think this is vital, you've got to benchmark against relevant comparators, because there is value in paying high fees for certain types of management. It will change your outcomes massively. So target your spending and compare it against the right things. The tools for doing that are increasing. That's all I wanted to say then, and I'll hand back to Tiffany for the Q&A, I think.
Fantastic. Well, we've got 20 minutes for a discussion, which is a nice chunk of time. So well done, everyone, for keeping to time with the presentations. We've got some questions coming through, but I'd like to start with one of my own. So, as we all know, because of the shifting responsibilities onto individuals for their own well-being and in retirement, do you think that that's sustainable, or do you think that's even reasonable?
Shall I start?
Yeah, sure.
I get very concerned when we talk about engagement as a way forward, because for the vast majority of people, I don't think engagement that could lead to positive outcomes is likely to happen. I'll just give an example of how engagement with people who maybe don't have the financial capability or support to make good decisions can actually lead to negative outcomes. And this is the example in Sweden. At the turn of the century, or maybe it was later, it was very recent, they introduced a raft of private pension schemes in Sweden, and they had a massive media campaign encouraging people to make active investments. And I think around 76% of people who were enrolled into these schemes made active investments. And the vast majority of these choices were quite poor and ended up with people having much lower levels of returns than they would have had if they'd just gone into the default fund. And this is because people didn't really make these decisions based on what was necessarily best for their portfolio. It was about emotional attachment, so they were likely to choose things that were local in Sweden or had to do with an industry that they cared about. And then once the media campaign was withdrawn, these people then just stayed in these funds and stopped making any sort of active investment. And I think it's a really crucial example of how engagement is not necessarily the answer. The answer is supporting people. And another figure that I think is fascinating is that 1 in 4 people in the UK cannot correctly identify their balance, their bank account balance on a statement. So I think what we're dealing with here is some people for whom engagement is a great thing, who can make a lot of decisions, but the majority of the population who are going to need to be supported. And that's going to rely on government, industry, charities, and basically everybody who's in the pensions community, making sure that people are having better outcomes.
Great. Matthew, too?
Yeah, I'll give you my perspective on this. I think it's unsustainable for pensions to continue living in a bubble, isolated from the rest of savings and financial commitments. And that was what I was beginning to get to in one of my slides there. I mean, another macro theme alongside my consolidation and collectivism actually is the rise of individuality. When you go and buy a coffee, you don't just go and buy a coffee, you're assaulted with 25 different varieties of coffee made exactly how you want it. It's tailored to you as an individual. And the same is becoming true for financial services and in particular pensions. And as a result of that, you need to see pensions in the broader savings and financial space, and therefore help individuals, members, to understand pensions in context. And that is the route to engagement when they see it as part of their overall well-being.
I agree, engagement's key here. I think communication and awareness will improve things, but ultimately you can push that, and I'm with Daniela, I think ultimately some people won't engage, or they'll engage in the wrong way. So you need some safety net behind it. But ultimately I think this is going to come to the fore, and people are going to appreciate it more once the bad outcomes start being generated. It's very hard to create a platform for people to engage without them feeling some of the pain or seeing the awareness of that. And I think that's the difficulty, and that hasn't really started to emerge fully yet.
Okay. There's a question for Daniela from the app. Who do you see providing the support that's needed?
Well, I actually think that a lot of it is out there in a rather, well, I wouldn't say fetal state, because I think we're beyond the fetal state. Pensions-wise, I know people like to say, oh, pensions-wise take-up isn't as good as it could be, but I think it's been pretty good. 1 in 5 people who are accessing savings are using pensions-wise. And when Freedom and Choice was announced just a few years ago, and pensions-wise was just a spark in the minister's eye, I don't think we necessarily anticipated that it would get anyone at all coming to it. And this doesn't mean that the other 4 out of 5 people aren't getting help. You know, people are still using advice, people are still going to TPAS, people are using the money advice service. PensionWise likes to point out that while 1 in 5 people are having actual sessions with them, millions of people are using their website for information. And I think we're in very early stages, but there's definitely a whole system of support that's being built up. There's obviously going to be a lot of pressure on the new financial guidance body to really ensure that people who need support are getting it. But there's so many people supporting them. There's the government, there's industry, there's charities. There's a lot of people working really hard to make sure that, that the support is out there. And there's also some work around default retirement pathways, whether or not we can put these in place. So I'm fairly confident that with all the focus that is being given at the moment to supporting people, that by, say, 2025, 2030, we're going to see a very different system for people who are both saving and accessing savings in retirement.
Do either of you have anything to add to that?
A thing I would say, so let me take my individuality theme along with individuality is choice over what you do with your pension savings. With choice comes responsibility. So I think the answer to your question, who needs to push on the engagement, actually is everybody. It's employers, it's trustees, it's the government, but it's also the individuals themselves recognising there's responsibility here to make choices.
There's a question actually that's just come through for you as well, Tim, about you've talked about what people running schemes should be monitoring today. What, in your view, will need to be monitored in 2025?
In 2025, I mean, at high-level monitoring, you want to make sure you're hitting the investment outcomes. So I think cost is important. I think you need to know how your assets are being invested responsibly around the things we talked about. But ultimately, the first and primary, I think it is about, are you achieving the returns to fill the savings gaps that's being talked about? But I do think most of these things can be combined together effectively. The bit that worries me about things like responsible investing, it's seen as an either-or. It definitely isn't. Responsible investing is about better investing to improve outcomes.
Are there any questions in the audience before I turn to... There's one in the back there.
Yeah, I'd like to thank Tim Giles for his vision. I'm very grateful to him. I mean, it's very good. I'm a trustee, a voluntary trustee, and I'm very pleased to hear that if we pay a fund manager more, we get a better investment return. I mean, what sort of world do you live in?
Thank you for the comment. I'd agree with you that I wasn't pretending to say we definitely pay them more. I think at the moment there is a low correlation between what is being paid and the value add. I do think, though, there are certain asset classes which you will pay more to invest in. I'll give you property as an example. And if you want to have some of the diversification benefits of that within your strategy, you will pay more for it. I don't think paying the lowest fee per se is a good thing. I think it's about figuring out what you value within your strategy and paying for what you value. Apologies if I didn't get that across.
Any other questions in the audience for now? I had another one, actually. So on the theme of engagement and individual responsibility, some argue that savings is still a luxury. Soaring housing costs, depressed wages. Is there anything that can be done to help change the attitude and confidence in savings?
Well, I think this speaks to actually one of the questions that came up in the plenary session, which was about the volume of lump sums being taken from DC plans at retirement. And the kind of the thrust of the question is that's wrong. Well, actually, is it? You know, for some people, using their retirement savings to pay off their mortgage or short-term debt is a perfectly rational conclusion to have come to. So I think it's a bit of a sweeping generalisation to say lump sums from pensions are a bad thing. And I think you've also got to take things like the state pension into consideration when you're looking at people's overall savings. So, it's hard. And that was really the point that I was trying to get across earlier. This saving for retirement issue is a really complex thing. And hence why I think technology might be part of the answer here.
Daniela, speaking of the state pension, what role do you think the state pension could play?
I think as I showed with the stats in terms of people's retirement incomes dropping, the state pension is going to play a critical role in the future. We saw that we're going to have to wait until around 2060 for average incomes to reach the level that they are now, and that's with the triple lock. Without the triple lock, I don't know how much longer it will be because that wasn't actually part of the modelling. But also from what we've looked at and from work that Age UK has done, the state pension is the main source of income for most people in retirement and will continue to be so. And so the level of the state pension will be critical in determining how many people are in poverty. And also to be that backfiller so that you have a sensible level of income that you can then top up with private pensions. So I think there's a lot of focus right now on what we're doing with auto-enrollment and how we can raise contribution levels. But we really need to maintain focus on the state pension and the role that it plays in people's lives and not scoff at it, because £8,000 a year is a really significant amount of money. And to get that from a private pension, you would have to be saving your whole life at relatively high levels.
I think this question is for Tim. We dwell on ESG in the UK. Should we not be more aligned to sustainable investing, aligned to UN principles?
I mean, the definition I gave of responsible investing is basically picking up on the UN principles of responsible investing. I agree. It's about thinking through how we're just going to get better long-term returns. I mean, pensions is ultimately long-term saving. Responsible investing is about getting better long-term returns in a responsible way.
There's a clarification question here, I think, for Daniela. On the value of the mean size pot of around 50K, is that taking into account people who might have multiple pensions?
It is, yes. What we've done is we've used the Wealth and Asset Survey, I believe. And so it actually looks at the disparate amount of people's total DC savings. And then we make assumptions that people who, or is it ELSA? This is very embarrassing. It's either the Wealth and Asset Survey or the English Longitudinal Study of Aging, but one of those where we assume that people who are currently saving continue saving at their current levels and don't opt out and that sort of thing. So yeah, it's actually the median value, not the mean average. And if you want to look further, we have published a report called the Future Book, which shows the full distribution for different cohorts going forward.
Are there any other questions in the audience at this stage? Okay, oh, there's one back here. While we're making our way over there, I thought I'd throw in another one. Do you think we will still be using the word pension in DC in 2025? So I think that's probably a nod to like the US and maybe 401ks possibly.
Move back to superannuation as an improvement. Yeah, maybe not. But I'm being flippant. But the word pension does, in many real people's eyes, have bad connotations with it, and therefore I think actually there is a lot of sense in the question that if we start thinking about it as retirement savings or something of that nature, that might be more positive.
There's someone back there.
Thank you. Matthew, you talked about collectivism and individualism, which slightly confused me, but that was probably getting up early for the run this morning. But going back to the collectivism in terms of CDC, a wage for life is a great thing, and that's obviously what DB has provided for a generation that are going through now. Not everyone, but a lot of people are benefiting from that. But in terms of the way that works in DC, obviously an annuity provided a wage for life. That's what it was there to do, and the industry and everyone around it managed to kill that sort of golden goose off, partly due to the regulatory arbitrage and the way that the assets had to be held to provide the security. CDC is going to do broadly the same thing. It's going to provide a wage for life. It's collecting money together to pay out. There is pooling. It's all of those same things in there. I won't mention the with profits thing because that's an unfair comparison. But isn't CDC going to pay out more predominantly because of that regulatory arbitrage? Because you don't have to hold the same sorts of assets.
It comes down to the price of guarantees. An annuity has a guarantee, a CDC income does not. It could go down. If you're going to provide that guarantee of no possibility of reductions, that is extremely expensive to do, and we see that in the cost of annuities. If you don't have to provide that underlying floor of zero, you can invest differently, invest in more return-seeking assets, and the price of what you're buying is cheaper. That's what it fundamentally comes to.
Role of technology. How dependent is this on the dashboard, and what is Plan B?
Oh, I'm answering this, am I?
Or no, we could.
No, I'm happy to answer that. What is Plan B? I feel concerned that we think the dashboard is a sort of panacea. It's not just going to tell people where their pensions are. It's going to solve the issues of engagement. It's going to make people save more. I think the dashboard is going to be really good. And I'd like to point out that the dashboard is actually a compromise. If some of you remember back to Pot Follows Member, and there were lots of problems with Pot Follows Member, and then people said, well, let's have a pensions aggregator, and then that's what the dashboard was born from. So this is really about small pots and people knowing where their pots are, and I think that it's definitely a key in the puzzle, and it will definitely be helpful, and it will definitely mean that people who are engaged will find it easier to find out where their pots are. But there needs to be a lot more happening alongside the dashboard if we really want to give people a technological platform to be able to make really informed decisions about saving and about how to access savings.
Okay. Would you like to add anything else either?
Well, the only thing I would say is, it's not just pensions. Let's look beyond pensions, which is another point I was making earlier. So, I think we're going to have all sorts of solutions grow over the next 7 years, and we'll see which ones are the winners, if you like, over that period, but it's going to include more than pensions.
I think the other piece around this is back to this data theme as well, is there is increasing amounts of data out there. You need something akin to a dashboard or some way of bringing that together to make head or tail out of it. We can't expect data is going to diminish. So you can say, well, if the dashboard fails, and you need to have trust within that dashboard, the plan B is ultimately going to be something else to better provide that information and bring that data to make sense of it.
We have time for about 2 more questions. Is there anyone else in the audience who would like to ask something? No? Okay, well, there's one here that says... Oh, there is. Sorry. This gentleman up front. While the mic is making its way up here, I'll ask one from the iPad. Question to Tim. Automatic enrolment is going to be introduced in Ireland. If you had to design it from scratch, what would you change from the UK?
The bit that worries me from the Irish perspective is that there is no default into Nest. There is this piece that, so that's probably what would I change. It's probably more what I would put in. I think Nest has a valuable role where people won't engage in this at the moment, that it fulfills that need. Without that in Ireland, I worry about what's going to happen for some of the schemes. The consolidation problem could be far worse than the one that Matthew's suggesting. Yeah.
Okay. Jerry Andy, Schneider Electric. I'm going back to the issue of CDC and the comment you made, which is very relevant, that there's no guarantee. And that's a commitment by the scheme to pay an income for the future. What's the difference between what we used to have in DB, where pension schemes were set up by companies with the best intention of delivering, with a provision for indexation when they could afford it, and then imposed on them was the requirement to lock it in? Are we not at risk with CDC in 10, 15, 20 years' time, when they start to go the wrong way? Many people are benefiting from it. The government reaction and public reaction says, hey guys, something's gone wrong here, and an imposition being imposed on employers then to say fund it.
Yeah, so the 2 models you put forward there, on the face of it, they do look really pretty similar. I think the difference here is collective DC is DC by definition, right? So therefore, there is no obligation back on the employer beyond the regular contribution going in.
I still fear for regulation.
Okay, I'd just like to ask one last question, if that's all right. So going on the theme about engagement, individual responsibility, about 2 years ago, Scottish Widows and Fawcett Society put together a research survey that showed that women severely undersaved, which we know, and some of the reasons behind that, some of the drives that they identified in that report was basically saying that women often say that their needs come last, their salary often goes directly to childcare, and so by the time that's all done, there's nothing left for them to save. So how would you respond to that in terms of what kind of interventions, what technology we might be able to use to address this particular problem in saving in this portion of the population?
I mean, two of the themes that I think are relevant. One is about making sure the investments are linked into the values of the investor as much as anything, and also making sure it's cheaper. I'm not sure technology is the solution, but I also go out to some of the points you're making. Some of this is more fundamental changes needed in flexibility within the workplace, all these things to sort of improve different pay differentials, and that will address the issue. If the issue is fundamentally resources aren't being directed in the right place in the economy, that's not going to be changed by having a better piece of technology. Yeah.
I think it's worth recognising that we can't always necessarily change behaviour. Sometimes we have to work with behaviour, and I remember that piece was very interesting. It was about how in a sort of male-female couple with children, it was often felt by everybody that the man's money that was earned was used for sort of long-term financial planning, and the woman's money was used for more short-term household things. So there was a suggestion that I think is definitely worth exploring, that saving is done more on a household basis. So actually, if you have a higher earner, some of their income goes into the pension savings of the lower earner, so that actually it's a bit more fairly distributed, and they can then arrange their income in the way that they want, because I think it's quite difficult to force women who have had children and who feel a certain way to suddenly think, well, I guess you're right, I shouldn't prioritize my children, I shouldn't prioritize my family. And I think also that auto-enrollment really shows us how successful working with behaviour rather than against behaviour is. We've taken real advantage of inertia. This might be another opportunity to take advantage of behavioural patterns.
Any other last words? Okay. Well, unfortunately, we've come to the end of our session, but I think we can all agree that we've had some really great expertise shared with us today. I just wanted to make a note. Please remember to rate this session on your app, and also downstairs we have a Learning Hub session with Leslie Titcombe, so please go along to that as well. And please join me in thanking our guests today for their time.